It's September 24th, 1969, 13 months after the bloody riots that marred the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Mayor Daley's Chicago. It's the opening day of the trial of the so-called Chicago 8, 8 radicals that the government accuses of crossing state lines with the intent to start a riot. On the bench is 74-year-old Judge Julius Hoffman. Hoffman is one tough judge, pro-prosecution and abrasive. Defense attorneys William Kunstler and Leonard Weinglass have submitted to Judge Hoffman a list of 54 proposed questions they would like to ask potential jurors. Questions designed to reveal cultural biases. Biases that can mean the difference between a vote to convict and a vote to acquit in a trial that will be a lot about culture and counterculture. Among the questions are, do you know who Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix are? Would you let your son or daughter marry a yippie? And if your children are female, do they wear bras all the time? Judge Hoffman announces that he will reject all but one of the defense's proposed questions. He asks potential jurors only, are you or do you have any close friends or relatives who are employed by any law enforcement agencies? It's just the first of a long list of Hoffman decisions that will go against the defense. The 300 members of the panel of potential jurors are overwhelmingly white, middle class, and middle-aged. They remind author and trial observer J. Anthony Lucas of the Rolling Meadows Bowling League lost on their way to the lanes. In just 3 hours, a jury of 2 men and 10 women is seated. The Chicago 8 trial has variously been described as a travesty of justice, a circus, an important battle for the hearts and minds of the American people, and a monumental non-event. What did it all mean? Well, one thing we can say is this. Few events better exemplify the conflicts of values that characterized the late 60s than the trial of the Chicago 8. On the Tet holiday at the end of January in 1968, Viet Cong units surged across South Vietnam. In a single weekend, 40,000 people lost their lives, including 2,500 U.S. soldiers. In 1968 alone, the bloodiest year of the war, 17,000 Americans died. As the death toll mounted, the Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular, and so did the president who championed that war, Lyndon Baines Johnson. In March of 1968, however, it was still widely assumed that the Democrats would renominate LBJ when they gathered in Chicago for their national convention. 200 activists gathered that month at Lake Villa near Chicago. They gathered to discuss whether to call for protests at the August convention. And if so, what sort of protests? Older, established peace groups had joined forces to create an organization called the Mobilization to End the War in Vietnam, or MOB for short. The MOB-sponsored conference revealed deep divisions among the activists. Many MOB leaders, such as Tom Hayden, Rennie Davis, and David Dellinger, urged nonviolent protests at the Democratic National Convention. More radical factions at the conference argued for aggressive street action and civil disobedience. Leaders from a newly formed organization calling itself the Youth International Party, or Yippies, also attended the Lake Villa meeting. They were not impressed by what they saw. For several months, the Yippies had been promoting their own plan for Chicago at convention time, an event they called the Festival of Life. Yippie founders Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin called for youth to gather in Chicago. In a statement from Yip. An excerpt from the statement will give you an idea of Yip's plans. It is summer. It is the last week in August, and the National Death Party meets to bless Lyndon Johnson. We are there. There are 50,000 of us dancing in the streets, throbbing with amplifiers and harmony. We are making love in the parks. We are reading, singing, laughing, printing newspapers, groping, and making a mock convention, and celebrating the birth of free America in our own time. Everything will be free. Bring blankets, tents, draft cards, body paint, Mr. Leary's cow, food to share, music, eager skin, and happiness. The threats of LBJ, Mayor Daley, and J. Edgar Frico will not stop us. At the Lake Villa meeting, a 21-page document authored by Hayden and Davis was distributed to the attendees. The document recommended nonviolent protests. Others at the meeting argued against protests at all and suggested instead uniting behind a peace candidate, such as Senator Eugene McCarthy. Abbie Hoffman ridiculed the endless debates over strategy. He said, "For 2 days, Moab debated whether or not they should go to Chicago. We laughed at them. While they argued back and forth, we got stoned, made love to pretty girls, and carried on." 1 week after the Lake Villa meeting, and facing strong opposition from within his own party, President Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election. Johnson's decision prompted Robert Kennedy to enter the race as an anti-war candidate. But Kennedy was shot and killed the night he won the California primary. So the battle for the nomination came down to a fight between two Minnesotans, Senator McCarthy and Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Despite not competing in the primaries, Humphrey had the upper hand. Party leaders mostly lined up behind him. Meanwhile, Chicago Mayor Richard Daley saw the Democratic Convention as a grand opportunity to promote his city to the world. He resolved not to have any anti-war demonstrators spoil his plans. When the Yippies filed a request to sleep in city parks, the city administrator said no. Moreover, the administrator announced that during the convention, an 11 p.m. curfew would be enforced in all city parks. Mayor Daley put the city's 12,000 police officers on 12-hour shifts to keep the demonstrators in line. In addition, 7,500 Army troops and 6,000 National Guardsmen, requested by Daley to aid in keeping order, all arrived in Chicago. Hoffman and Rubin did their best to make the mayor and city officials nervous. They announced ever wilder plans for the Festival of Life. Plans like placing LSD in the Chicago water supply, dressing Yippies as hotel bellboys and seducing the wives of convention delegates, releasing greased pigs throughout the city, and picking up delegates in fake taxis and driving them to Wisconsin. Dellinger, Hayden, Davis, and the other Moab leaders had more serious plans for Convention Week. They proposed teach-ins, anti-war speeches, and anti-war protests. In late August, mostly student-age anti-war and counterculture activists began arriving in Chicago. Demonstration leaders predicted 100,000 protesters would show up, but the actual number was far below that, closer to 10,000. On the Friday before the convention, a federal district judge denied Moab's request for an injunction that would have lifted the 11 p.m. curfew for the use of city parks. The first significant confrontation between police and demonstrators occurred the next night. Police tear-gassed some protesters. Poet Allen Ginsberg helped avoid a more serious confrontation. Ginsberg led demonstrators out of Lincoln Park chanting, "Om." Sunday, August 25th, was the date of the much heralded Festival of Life, featuring rock music and revelry. But only one band showed up, and it was reluctant to perform. The band feared that the police would destroy their sound system. Young people in the park handed out flowers, smoked pot, made out, and listened to some poetry. About 10:30, a police officer with a bullhorn walked through the park saying, "The park is closing. If you stay in the park, you'll be arrested." Some young people responded to the demand by throwing objects at a police car. At 11 o'clock, police charged after people still in the park, tear-gassing and clubbing them. Some youth responded by smashing car windows and vandalizing buildings. The following night, police cracked more heads and fired more tear gas grenades, attacking about 3,000 demonstrators. Abbie Hoffman was among them. He urged demonstrators to hold the park and called for the protesters to mess up the pigs at the convention. A police officer arrested Tom Hayden after he spotted him letting the air out of the tires of a police car. Sometime after midnight, Rennie Davis stood on the barricades in Lincoln Park with a megaphone and told the people to, quote, "Fight the pigs." Tuesday was a multi-ring circus in Chicago. It began with a sunrise service of chants, prayers, and meditation in Lincoln Park led by Allen Ginsberg. In the Chicago Coliseum, about 4,000 persons gathered to hear David Dellinger and folk singer Phil Oakes, novelist William Burroughs, and a variety of other peace movement celebrities. Black Panther leader Bobby Seale spoke to the crowd in Lincoln Park. Seale told the crowd that the police violence must be met with violence. Abby Hoffman, having lost patience with Moab's nonviolent stance, met with the Blackstone Rangers, a Chicago street gang. He discussed with the Rangers the possibility of them coming to the park that night with weapons. Shortly after 11 p.m., the nightly police routine of clubbing and tear gassing was repeated in Lincoln Park. Convention week violence peaked on Wednesday, August 28th, the day Hubert Humphrey received the Democratic nomination for president. The day began with the arrest of Abby Hoffman while he was having breakfast. Hoffman was charged with public indecency for having written a four-letter word on his forehead. Hoffman told the police he put the offensive word on his forehead to discourage the press from photographing him. In the afternoon, Dellinger, Seale, Davis, and Hayden addressed a large crowd of demonstrators at the bandshell in Grant Park, opposite the convention's headquarters hotel. Tom Hayden allegedly told the audience, "Make sure that if the blood is going to flow, let it flow all over the city. If we're going to be disrupted and violated, let the whole stinking city be disrupted. I'll see you in the streets." About 3 p.m., some people in the crowd lowered an American flag from a flagpole and attempted to raise a red flag in its place. Police moved in to retrieve the American flag. Jerry Rubin yelled, "Kill the pigs! Kill the pigs!" In another incident, Rennie Davis was clubbed unconscious and taken to a hospital. In the evening, near the International Amphitheater, where the Democrats were nominating Humphrey, police stopped a march of about 1,500 people. They attacked demonstrators with tear gas and clubs at numerous street intersections in the area. The scenes of the clubbing were carried live on television across the country. This was the riot that America remembers. Whether one calls it a riot of protesters or a riot of police remains a matter of opinion. The clubbing and the tear gassing finally let up on Thursday, but protests continued. A police undercover officer in the park targeted two anti-war activists, John Froines and Lee Weiner. According to the officer, Froines asked demonstrators to bring more ammunition to use against the police. Weiner, meanwhile, allegedly told the undercover officer about a plan to use Molotov cocktails to create chaos in Chicago's downtown loop. Weiner asked the undercover officer to gather bottles, sand, rags, and gasoline needed to make the Molotov cocktails. Now, of course, what happened in Chicago shocked the country. But what to do about it? Some people demanded that leaders responsible for the protests be put on trial. Other people suggested it was the police officers who needed to be prosecuted. Prior to the 1968 Civil Rights Act, rioting and incitement to riot was a strictly local law enforcement issue. But in response to the increasing number of anti-war protests around the country, and these anti-war riot provisions were included in the Civil Rights Act. The provisions made it a federal crime to cross state lines with the intent to incite a riot. Now, President Johnson's Justice Department was reluctant to use the new provisions for a prosecution in Chicago. Attorney General Ramsey Clark viewed what happened as primarily a police riot. He was more interested in prosecuting police officers for brutality than he was in prosecuting the demonstrators for rioting. The Justice Department's lack of interest in prosecuting the protest leaders outraged Mayor Daley. Daley convinced a close friend and a federal judge to summon a grand jury to consider possible violations of the anti-riot law. And in March 1969, the jury returned indictments against 8 demonstrators, balanced exactly by indictments against 8 police officers. The 8 indicted demonstrators were Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, David Dellinger, Tom Hayden, Rennie Davis, John Freunds, Lee Weiner, and Bobby Seale. It was an interesting collection of defendants. Though all were charged with conspiracy, some of the defendants had never even met each other. The defendants chosen seemed to be chosen as representatives of various strands of the anti-war movement. Hoffman and Rubin from the culturally focused Yippies, Hayden, Davis, and Dellinger from MOB, and Bobby Seale from the Black Panther Party, an organization focused on racial justice issues. By the time the grand jury returned its indictments, Ramsey Clark lacked the power to object. Richard Nixon occupied the White House, and Nixon's new Attorney General, John Mitchell, had none of his predecessors' reluctance about prosecuting demonstrators. He gave the green light to prosecute. Regular observers at the trial noted the stark contrast between the scenes at the defense and prosecution tables. At the defense table, defendants relaxed in blue jeans and sweatshirts. They often propped their feet up on chairs or the table itself. Hoffman and Rubin often wore headbands, buttons, beads, and colorful shirts. The defendants passed trial hours munching jelly beans, cracking jokes, offering editorial comments, making faces, reading newspapers, and sleeping. They littered the area around the defense table with clothing and candy wrappers. One day, even a package of marijuana turned up. The prosecution table, on the other hand, was a study in formality. Silver-haired District Attorney Thomas Ferran and his young assistant, Richard Schultz, sat stiffly. They dressed in business suits and were a picture of neatness and efficiency. The prosecution table remained clear of all but carefully arranged notes, a file of index cards, and a pencil or two. The defense ranks were divided on trial strategy. Some of the defendants, such as Tom Hayden, wanted to play the trial straight and focus on winning over jurors by exposing weaknesses in the prosecution's case. They were not interested in turning the trial into a circus. But other defendants, such as Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman, wanted a circus. They saw the trial as an opportunity to appeal to young people around the country. If the trial was entertaining theater, it would get the maximum attention of the press. It's no surprise then that Rubin and Hoffman often found creative ways of spicing up the trial. One day they wore judicial robes into court. Another day they brought in a birthday cake. They blew kisses to the jury, bared their chests, and placed the flag of the National Liberation Front on the defense table. In his account of the trial, the barnyard epithet and other obscenities, J. Anthony Lucas divided the Chicago conspiracy trial into 5 phases. The first period Lucas called the jelly bean phase. This was a relatively uneventful stage during which the defendants took a gently mocking stance toward the trial. The second phase was the gags and shackles phase. Defendants, perhaps worried that the trial was becoming to be seen as a joke, emphasized political issues, and during this phase, the plight of Black Panther defendant Bobby Seale drew front and center. Seale's chosen attorney was in the hospital for gallbladder surgery, and Seale wanted the trial delayed or at least be able to represent himself. When Judge Julius Hoffman denied his repeated requests, Seale hurled attacks at him in increasingly angry tones. Seale called Hoffman a fascist dog, a pig, and a racist, among other things. Finally, Judge Hoffman had enough. He ordered Seale bound and gagged. A week later, Judge Hoffman severed Seale from the case and sentenced him to 4 years in prison for contempt. The Chicago 8 trial had become the Chicago 7 trial. Lucas called Phase 3 Government's Day in Court. It was a calmer period with only 9 instances of contempt. The defendants realized that the prosecution's case was surprisingly weak. They sensed an opportunity for at least a hung jury. So the defendants cooled it for a while in the hopes of avoiding having the jury turn against them. The heart of the government's case in this Phase 3 was presented through the testimony of 3 undercover agents who had infiltrated the radical ranks. One agent served as Jerry Rubin's bodyguard. Another agent had become a leader in the group Vets for Peace. And a third agent maneuvered his way into a leadership position in the SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. On the stand, the undercover agents described plots to disrupt traffic, take over hotels, sabotage restrooms, and engage in other hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. Judge Hoffman helped the government's case along. Hoffman ruled for the government time and time again in evidentiary disputes. Judge Hoffman did not seem to believe that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. For example, he allowed the prosecution to introduce speeches the defendants made before their arrival in Chicago when they supported the government's case, but he ruled that the defense could not introduce statements made before Chicago on the ground that they would be, quote, self-serving. Thus, the defendants' efforts to show they came to Chicago with peaceable intentions were excluded. Lucas called Phase 4 of the trial the sing-along with Phil and Judy phase. During this period, the defense presented its witnesses. They were a virtual who's who of the American left. The witnesses included the guru of the drug culture, Timothy Leary, poet Allen Ginsberg, author Norman Mailer, and folk singers Phil Oakes, Arlo Guthrie, Country Joe McDonnell, Pete Seeger, and Judy Collins, among many others. The defense tried to portray the defendants as committed idealists who reacted spontaneously to police violence. The defense tried to show that what the prosecution saw as dangerous plots, such as the supposed Yippie conspiracy to place LSD in the Chicago water supply, were intended as jokes, tweaks of the establishment. The defense also attempted to make the Vietnam War an issue in the trial, but Judge Hoffman swatted that effort down. The defense zeroed in on the prosecution's theory that the defendants were part of a conspiracy to incite a riot. Defense witnesses testified that the alleged conspirators never once met as a group. Moreover, if they ever had met, they wouldn't have agreed on just about anything. Defense witness Norman Mailer probably made the point best when he said, "Left-wingers are incapable of conspiracy because they're all egomaniacs." Abby Hoffman made the same point more colorfully in his testimony. "Conspiracy?" Hoffman asked. "Hell, we couldn't agree on lunch." The final phase of the trial was the barnyard epithet phase. It was a 2-week period marked by angry outbursts by the defendants and outbursts by their attorneys. The outbursts produced an almost irrational overreaction from Judge Hoffman, who issued 48 separate citations for contempt of court. The jury had just begun its deliberations when Judge Hoffman sentenced each of the defendants and the 2 defense attorneys, William Kunstler and Leonard Weinglass, to lengthy prison terms for criminal contempt of court. Some of the specifications related to minor acts of disrespect, such as not standing for the judge. Others concerned acts that the defendants considered harmless play, such as burying a rib cage or blowing kisses to the jury, while still other specifications related to insults the defendants hurled at Judge Hoffman: liar, hypocrite, and fascist dog. William Kunstler, who so strongly identified with his clients as to have lost a balanced perspective that a lawyer should try to keep, was sentenced to over 4 years in jail. One specification concerned an incident in which Kunstler said, "I'm going to turn back to my seat with the realization that everything I have learned throughout my life has come to naught, and that there is no meaning in this court, there is no law in this court." As draconian as they were, the contempt convictions didn't stand. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals reversed them all, holding that contempt convictions resulting in more than 6 months in prison required jury trials and could not be imposed by a judge alone. Jury deliberations were difficult. Jurors initially split, 8 for conviction on all counts and 4 for acquittal on all the charges. When the jury foreman reported that it was hung, Judge Hoffman ordered the jury to keep deliberating. And eventually a compromise was brokered between the two factions. In the end, jurors acquitted all defendants on the conspiracy charge, while finding guilty each of the 5 defendants charged with having an intent to incite a riot while crossing state lines. The jury acquitted Freunds and Weiner on the charge of teaching and demonstrating the use of an incendiary device. On February 20th, 1970, Judge Hoffman sentenced the 5 men who had been found guilty. Each defendant made a statement before sentence was imposed. David Dellinger told Judge Hoffman that he was a man who had too much power over too many people for too many years, but said he admired the judge's spunk. Rennie Davis said that when he got out of prison, he intended to move next door to prosecutor Tom Ferran and bring the prosecutor's sons and daughter into the revolution. Tom Hayden said, "We would hardly have been notorious characters if they left us alone on the streets of Chicago." But, Hayden added, because of the police violence, we became the architects, the masterminds, and the geniuses of a conspiracy to overthrow the government. We were invented. Abby Hoffman recommended that Judge Hoffman try experimenting with LSD. "I know a good dealer. I can fix you up." Jerry Rubin offered the judge a copy of his new book, Do It. The book contained an inscription inside, "Julius, you radicalized more young people than we ever could. You're the country's top yippie." Judge Hoffman listened to each statement, then he sentenced each defendant to 5 years in prison. The Chicago Radicals never served a day of their sentences. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals reversed all convictions in November 1972. The appellate court based its decision on Judge Hoffman's refusal to allow inquiry into the cultural biases of potential jurors. The court also cited Judge Hoffman's deprecatory and antagonistic attitude towards the defense. And finally, the court noted a shocking development that arose after appellate arguments. The FBI, with the apparent knowledge and complicity of Judge Hoffman and prosecutors, bugged the offices of the Chicago defense attorneys. The Court of Appeals said that it, quote, had little doubt but that the wrongdoing of FBI agents would have required reversal of the convictions on the substantive charges. As for the other Chicago 8 trial, all 8 police officers charged with violating the civil rights of demonstrators won dismissal of charges or were acquitted. Richard Schultz explained the verdicts. The people who sit on juries in the city are just not ready to convict a Chicago policeman. There is no simple yes or no answer to the question of whether the Chicago defendants intended to incite a riot in Chicago in 1968. Even Abby Hoffman said, "I don't know whether I'm innocent or I'm guilty." The reason for the confusion, as Norman Mailer pointed out during the trial, was that the alleged conspirators understood that you didn't have to attack the fortress anymore. All they had to do was surround it, make faces at the people inside, and let them have nervous breakdowns and destroy themselves. Without a doubt, the Chicago trial was one of the most unusual courtroom spectacles in American history. It brought together a hard-headed judge who feared his world was collapsing around him, and a group of defendants who saw the judge as representing everything they fought against. It was a recipe for disaster, a recipe for a monumental waste of courtroom time. But it was also a trial that involved the strangest of crimes, the crime of crossing a state line with the intent to start a riot. To answer the question of guilt or innocence required that the jury evaluate the ever-changing mental states of each of the defendants at a particular time in the past. It was an almost impossible task. The trial of the Chicago 8 is symbolic of American divisions in the late 1960s. A yawning chasm separated the mindset of the defendants from the mindset of Judge Julius Hoffman. And that chasm reflected the rift that ran through American society as the war in Vietnam dragged on. Police versus protester, establishment versus radical, decorum versus defiance. These were the polarities on display at the trial, and they reflected a nation being pulled apart by racial, generational, and even sexual tensions. Given these divisions, it's safe to say that the defendants never had a prayer at winning an outright acquittal. Some members of the jury clearly had no sympathy for the defendants or their causes. After the trial, one female juror said the defendants, quote, should be convicted for their appearance, their language, and their lifestyle. The jury foreman complained to a reporter, these defendants wouldn't even stand up when the judge walked in. When there is no more respect, we might as well give up on the United States. And a third juror was even more indignant. The juror told a reporter that the defendants should have been shot down by police. Thank God for the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals.